If we now look at the cover, we see that the Egyptians had a sign or T-shaped sign for trachea, which is F36, with a pair of lungs at the bottom, with the flood god Happy pumping the lungs with his foot. The present model is that this T corresponds to the Nile River mapped to the Mediterranean and the Phasis River, which forms a T-shaped. So this is the trachea of the earth god. And at the start of the trachea, we have a letter L shaped, the L branch of the Nile, which matches to the lip opening tool. So we have a pair of lungs over here, which matches to letter L. We have a T-shaped trachea, which matches to words such as teeth, tongue, trachea, tonsils, which corresponds to this water system here, which is T-shaped. However, the present model of linguistics and etymology argues that words such as trachea, which starts with letter T, comes from trachea arteria, and that the word trachea means rough. Which is the nominative vocative feminine singular of trachus. Which traces back to Proto-Indo-European invented words. This and this, which is hypothetically means rough, from this word, which means to irritate. So instead of noting the fact that Egyptians had signs for trachea, which start with which are T-shaped, linguists have, over the last 200 years, have invented an entire fictional civilization called the Proto-Indo-Europeans around the Caucasus Mountains to explain the commonality of the word or the origin of the word, such as trachea. We might ask, before digging into this, is why would someone want to learn Egyptian cosmological linguistics? The answer is that from the big picture of things, or scientific point of view, this is the standard model called the Huang model, or basic chemical thermodynamic model, wherein two reactants meet. Either they go through transition energy barrier and form products on the unstable side of the reaction, which are called anorganic, or they collide and react through the transition state and form exergonic products, such as a married couple and child, which are work energy releasing. So the scientists or inquisitive mind will want to know, where do these words ender, which means into, and gonic, which means work, or ergon, which means work, and why does X mean out of, meaning releases energy, and why is this energy absorbing? For example, why, when you spend a year or 3 fighting with someone, why is that absorb energy from the universe? So if we look up the word energonic, we see that it was coined by Charles Correll in 15A, an analogy with the term exothermic. So exo means out of, heat, and thermo means heat, so this means heat releasing. But why does the term exo mean out of? So when we look over here at a basic diagram of this, we see that a molecule such as ATP is an exergonic or energy releasing molecule when its phosphate or PO bonds are cleaved. It releases a certain 20 kilojoules per bond. And the second PO bond is cleaved, it releases another kilojoules per bond. And when the third PO bond is cleaved, it releases another kilojoules per bond. This is kind of like when you're cleaving the bonds of your children, it releases energy, like the Kennedy family, where JFK was one of America's most famous presidents. So the question is, why does the word X mean out of, or releasing, energy releasing? Conversely, why do the release of energy from ATP power cellular work, which is defined as endergonic? Wherein molecules inside of a cell are synthesized, powered by the exergonic release of energy. So endo, END means in. So why does EN mean in and EX mean out of? So if we go to Wikipedia endergonic, we see that it derives from end plus ergon, and the EN derives from endon within, which is rooted back to another fictional invented word from Proto-Indo-European, or with the dative form of EN. So again, a two-letter word has been traced back through pi, or Proto-Indo-European, to the asterisk H sub 1 E superscript sub En, which means hypothetical, reconstructedly means in, which is cognate with the tested words Latin in, Old Armenian I, and English in. So instead of figuring out or believing this nonsense about Proto-Indo-European, which is a fictional civilization, we can now go and use Egyptian cosmological linguistics to trace back to the fact of why there's an X right here, 049, coming out of the birth canal. Out of. We see the word X, which means out. This gives us a Egyptians are real versus Proto-Indo-Europeans, which are fake, fictional civilization, invented, linguistically invented civilization. So if we go to the contents page, we go to ECL2, click on contents. If we go to normal order, we see that if we put the Phoenician alphabet from alpha to what's called Tav in Hebrew, we see that the X is born out of the earth, the delta, which is the earth version of the vaginal canal of the stars goddess. Conversely, a letter N, which means into, is based on the is the 14th letter, and it's based on the N bend of the Nile. So when the Thales came after he studied in Egypt, he said everything goes back to water, which means that at the end of the yearly cycle, crops are grown. Crops eventually have to be, or Osiris, who is the crops, eventually gets thrown into the Nile, or his phallus gets thrown into letter N, and the cycle repeats again, meaning the 150-day flood of the Nile, which comes through the end bend of the Nile, which comes from the Ethiopian mountains over here, starts again. 150-day Nile flood comes, leaves behind the black soot of the Nile, and the Egyptians were able to grow crops. So most of the English words we're using now come from this farming cosmology-based system.